What I want to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit about economics. I'm going to talk about decision making. I'm going to talk about how human beings make decisions and choices, especially related to economics and marketing. And I'm hopefully going to touch in some issues related to horticulture and how we can use some of these knowledge that we have gained very recently and how we can use it so that people can make better and more informed decisions and choices, especially in the area of horticulture, in the way they eat, in the way they play, in the way they interact with the environment, with the landscaping, and the benefits that they obtain from these different products. So what I want to do is I'm going to start giving you a little bit of a history overview of how we got here. And in doing so, let me tell you that neoclassical economics was a revolutionary period in economics because we went from a highly descriptive way of talking about economic theory, in which mainly people describe theories and thoughts in an essay form, to use mathematics to explain behavior. Now, this was a very exciting time to be alive and a very exciting time to be an economist because we can match mathematics to human behavior. Now, an ever complex issue in terms of using more mathematical complexity in explaining these models is what got us today into the point where we're asking ourselves, well, what's happening with the main notions and ideas about neoclassical economics? Perhaps the greatest legacy of the time period for economics was the concept of this rational decision maker. And what that means is that individuals behave almost like a robot, carefully weighing benefits, or what we call in economics utility, or something that is in a positive dimension, and the loss or associated cost. So we interact with the real world when we make decisions, trying to maximize our pleasure and trying to minimize our pain. And that was the concept of rationality. Well, what happens in that period of time was, in the neoclassical period of time, that there was very little interest from mainstream economics about the process of how people arrive to make decisions. The behavioral process of how do people make choices as to what to buy, where to eat, how much to eat, which products to eat, how much to give to charity, and you name it. Many different decisions that we economists have been interested for a very long time. So along came a couple of economists, von Neumann and Daniel Kahneman from the psychology discipline, and they started to challenge this notion about rationality. And they said, wait a minute, there are some circumstances where people do not behave like this. And the economist's response was, well, as long as we can predict that behavior mathematically, does it really matter the process in which people make to arrive to those choices? Perhaps not. So the argument ended, or actually perhaps even became more heatedly debated, when Daniel Kahneman and Werner Smith won the Nobel laureate for being instrumental in two fields in economics. Behavioral economics, which is essentially about using theories from psychology to try to explain how people make decisions and how do they arrive at making those decisions. And then experimental economics, who borrow from physics the laboratory experimentation. And what Vernon tried to do was to simulate in a lab an economy, a situation in which people had to make choices. The importance of that being that those choices had to have economic consequences, because only then people will reveal their true behavior. Although if we go back to one of the first Nobel laureates in physics, what we observe in the real world is not really just the behavior, it's the behavior of people knowing that we are observing them. So in this perspective, we have these two views about neoclassical economics, and we also have this rising interest about behavior and how people arrive at those choices. Well, the result of all of these was the creation of an entirely new discipline called neuroeconomics. And it's using the brain to try to explain how people arrive at those decisions. So indeed, this is a really good time to be alive, and it's a really good time to be an economist and study some of this decision making. Even though the brain is a very complex muscle, it's a very complex machinery, it only weighs about 2% of the body weight, but it uses almost a fifth, almost 20% of the energy that we consume. So there are many different areas, and the brain is very complex. But in the last 5 or 10 years, we have discovered a lot of the brain functions and activities that are related specific to decision making. And there are certain areas that are pretty important when we make decisions. What distinguishes us from other mammals is the frontal lobe, or more specifically, the frontal cortex. That's how we make a lot of our decision making. Which, by the way, for those of you, Mike, who have teenager kids, that's one of the areas of the brain that is the last one to develop. So that's what we see teenagers behaving in a different ways because the frontal cortex is not fully developed. So their capability in some way is restricted. So it's not really their fault. You see, it's a biological issue. But there are certain areas in the brain that we look into when we talk about decision making. And I was talking about the frontal cortex, specifically the medial prefrontal cortex, the nucleus accumbens or the ventral striata, which are those areas of the brain that are typically associated with people evaluating choices and making decisions about different choices. We also have the insula, which typically activates when we look at different issues related to cost or prices, for example, in the terms of economics. So although the brain is very complex, these are probably the main areas that we look into when we look at decision making. I'm going to show you a few studies that I consider to be completely paradigm shifting in the way that we think and understand economics from the neurology perspective. The first one came from Benjamin Libet, and this is a very old experiment. It was performed in 1982, 1983, and what Libet did is he showed people this clock, which has come to be known as the Libet clock. And he told people, well, you're going to make a decision. And the decision you're going to be making is you're going to move either your right index finger or your left index finger. It doesn't matter which one. You make up your mind, you make a choice, and then move the finger. What he found is there was an activation in the brain about 550 milliseconds. That's about a half a second before there was actually an action. So the decision became, when do we really decide? Is it the moment we move the finger, or is it the moment that the activation in the brain started to move the finger? So this is what opened the door for more research in the area of neuroeconomics and neuromarketing. The next study I want to talk about is Knudsen et al. What he did is he did a very simple experiment. What he did in different stages, he had people evaluate different factors. So in the first stage, he showed people a product. So in this case, you can see a box of chocolates, Godiva. So what people saw was the product by itself, and he showed this product for about 4 seconds. The next decision was, he showed the product, but now you can see that the price appeared along with the product itself. And then he asked people to make a choice as to whether they wanted to buy the product or not. Then he had a 2-second fixation. And by the way, when you look at these images of the brain activating, what you're seeing is the difference between what activates in the brain under the treatment with the control. Because when you have a person, the brain is active most of the time. You're thinking about the immortality of a frog, and you're thinking about the test that you have tomorrow. You're thinking about what you're going to eat. You're thinking about the drink you're going to order when you go for dinner. You're thinking about that glass of wine you're going to have when you get home. And you're thinking about all of these issues. But we come and ask you, do you want to buy a box of Godiva chocolates? So what we see in these graphs is the difference between everything that activates when you're moving your eyes, when you're actively thinking about many other different things, and what happens with the control. So think about it as the subtraction of the treatment minus the control, and the activation here is like a p-value. It's not that a part of the brain activates by itself. It's the probability that there's a difference between the treatment and the control. So what he found in this case was that there was a lot more activation in the nucleus accumbens, or the ventral striata, where people were looking at the product. When we're doing the evaluation, the medial prefrontal cortex activated a lot more. But when they look at the price, the insula was activating. So for the first time, we came to understanding how people are starting and putting a picture of how people make decisions in terms of buying different products. The next one we want to talk about, which is crucial for many things that we do in food economics and horticulture, because we're facing an obesogenic epidemic in the U.S. You look at the immediate satisfaction of eating that amazing piece of chocolate cake, or delaying that reward to have a healthier lifestyle. So what this study that McClure did essentially look at is he asked people to do one thing. They wanted to either get the product right now for an immediate reward, or they could wait a little period of time and get a higher reward on a later period. So what you're looking at here is these red dots is the brain activation when people decided, no, I'm going to eat it today. There's a very famous experiment that was done with kids that they put some marshmallows and they observed whether kids will eat the marshmallows. The catch was they told them that if they waited and didn't eat the marshmallows, they will give them more marshmallows in the future. So this is part of what we're looking at in terms of the activation of the brain. How many people are eating the marshmallow today versus having more marshmallows in the future? And so what happened was you see a lot more of the activation when people are deciding to get the immediate gratification activates in the medial prefrontal cortex, in the ventral striatus, in the medial orbitofrontal cortex. All of the parts of the brain that are internal in the ventral area of the brain. On the contrary, those people who decided to wait, as you can see here, in 2 weeks or even a month later, the parts of the brain that activated went more on the dorsal or the lateral portions of the brain. Why is this significant? It's significant because it's showing you that we have two competing systems in the brain. One is telling you to eat the chocolate cake today, and the other one is telling you, no, don't do it. You have a health that you have to look out for, right? But it's biologically wired to compete in terms of the immediate reward versus the delayed reward versus immediate gratification. Now, what this shows here is the interaction between monetary gains and losses. Why is this important? Because it has been shown that there's a different effect that people feel in terms of rationality when they get a gain versus a loss. So if we ask people, for example, if I gave each one of you and I told you, well, you're going to participate in an experiment, and in this experiment, you can make different purchases. At the end of the experiment, I'm going to give you $50 to cover some of the purchases that you've made. Well, what this study is proving is that your reaction will be different than if I told you, hey, here's $50. Now I'm going to ask you to make the same decisions as to which products you're going to buy. And just the fact that you have ownership of those $50 changes the way in which your brain acts when making the decision as to what you're about to purchase. There is a loss aversion. People do not want to lose what they already perceive to be theirs, as opposed to obtaining something to gain. People are more averse to losing than what they are to try to gaining. Now, for those of us in marketing, and I think that in the food industry, we have had brands and branding a lot. My friend Charlie has been preaching to the green industry that we need to have a very strong differentiation strategy for selling our products. He's been showing that we need to have a branding. We finally start to see a lot of brands out there. So how does this branding effect work in the brain? Well, first of all, there are several studies that have been conducted that has shown that people respond to prestigious items and to branding. So in a very simple study, they asked people to come to participate in an experiment. Under one of the treatments, the person had a shirt that was unbranded. It was a very simple shirt. And what they showed was that when you had a person with the exact same color, it was the same except for the fact that it was a very known and recognized brand, that there were a lot of special treatment to the person who wore that branded shirt to the point to even become financially more important to have that branded product. We also see that most of the theoretical models to look at products, they're similar in quality, but the functionality differs. So in a way, you're trying to increase the perceived benefits or reduce the cost, maybe the transaction cost, the cost of searching, making it easy for people to buy that product, to see and find your product. Now, one of the challenges in doing these type of experiments, and I'm going to come back to this very issue because that's perhaps not the case in terms of horticultural products, But in many cases, the consumer is brainwired to think and associate high quality with high price. So if everything else is the same, if you have a watch that costs $100, you have another watch that costs $1,000, most people will associate the higher price watch to be of higher quality. That's not necessarily the case, but it tends to be very much correlated. Why do I say that's not the case in horticulture? Because if we have a problem in tomatoes and there is a plague in tomatoes and the tomato production is reduced substantially in the supply, what happens to the price? And what happens to the quality of those tomatoes because they were just hit with a plague or something else? Tends to be lower quality. So it's very difficult to the consumer to go to the grocery store and see, well, last week I was buying tomatoes for this price and now they're uglier than last week and they're more expensive. Can you explain that to me? And it's perhaps because they're used to have a very high correlation between price and quality. So what Plasman did is that he showed people, and he actually got people to taste two different types of wine. One wine was priced at $10, and the other one was priced at $90. The catch was, it was the exact same bottle of wine. The only difference between the two wines was the price. Everything else was exactly the same. The second catch, he put people under a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, and he looked at the brain while people were tasting the wines. So the bottom line is not only people reported higher tasting scores, which one do you think tasted better to most people? The high-priced wine won all of the tasting contests. But not only that, the medial prefrontal cortex, or orbitofrontal cortex, which is an area of the brain that is typically associated with pleasantness, activated a lot more with the $90 bottle of wine compared to the $10 bottle of wine. So what that's telling us is that we're microbiologically wired to derive pleasure from consuming branding and prestigious products. So in that context, we go all the way back, circle to the neoclassic, pre-neoclassical economics, to the classical economic period, to Thorstein Veblen. And he said, well, we don't really observe the wealth of the power of humans. What we observe is what they do with that power and that wealth. In other words, we do not observe the income, we observe what people buy with their income. We observe what they do with their power. And so that came to be known as conspicuous consumption, in deriving pleasure, deriving utility from consuming products that are prestigious or branded. So there are two main motivations as to people consuming these type of products. And those main motivations are invidious comparison, which is higher class individuals seeking to differentiate themselves from lower class individuals by the things that they purchase. So I'm rich and I'm gonna buy my Bentley so that people know that I'm different than everybody else, right? The second motivation is pecuniary emulation, and that is people of a lower social strata trying to be perceived as a higher class individual. So what better example than Jack in the Titanic, right? Pretending to be a rich person. So that signifies the pecuniary emulation. So what these guys put forward was, well, wait a minute. We're starting to see this phenomenon when even non-luxury type of products are starting to become conspicuous in consumption. So we started to ask the question, is it possible that healthy is the new wealthy? There's a new way of showing not only restraint, but showing that you have the income, the resources to buy those organic products, that you have to go to Whole Foods and buy the products at a substantially higher price. Well, if that's the case, we're starting to see a rise in social media. You have to show people that you're doing that. How do people show that? Well, if you look at their Facebook pages, they're starting to post pictures of the plate and how healthy they are, how many miles they ran today, and how healthy their lifestyle is compared to everybody else. So we have found that even in food products, we see this phenomenon of branding different products. So I think that would be very important as we move forward in terms of food consumption, nutrition, and health. So with that, let me introduce you the Texas A&M Agricultural Economics Human Behavior Lab. And these actually it started with a dream that Dr. Charlie Hall and Dr. Luis Rivera had, I guess about 2 years ago now. And we started thinking about ways of trying to get better explanations of different type of phenomenon that we could not find an explanation for. And so we said, well, why don't we dedicate the next 2 to 3 years to try to find some funding to buy some equipment to do some biometric research. Well, a couple of weeks later, we had the money to buy the eye tracking device. A couple of weeks later after that, we bought the EEG and so forth. The rest is history. And we've been spending the last couple of years trying to integrate some of this equipment into the type of research. The question is this going to change everything we know about economics? Certainly not. And the idea here is not to change everything we know about economics, is to complement what we know with these measures so we can improve the models that we do to measure consumer behavior and consumer willingness to pay, and to improve our understanding of how people arrive at those choices so we can help them make better decisions. So what do we have in the lab currently that we can use? Well, we have the eye tracking device, which is the highest resolution available device in the market. It tracks up to 300 data points per second. So we know exactly where people are looking at 300 times per second. That's a measure of attention, visual attention, but also arousal, because we also get a measure of pupil dilation. So we know whether people are getting excited by dilating their eyes. We also measure, if we're doing it in the computer screen, the distance from the eyes to the computer, which also gives us an indication of engagement, for example, when people are getting bored. Like, for example, right now the talk is not going that well, people start to go to the back. It's like, okay, so if I had an eye tracking device here, I can measure how interested you are in what I'm saying by looking at your posture. So it's the same idea here. You look at facial expression analysis. We use the movement of the face via an electromyograph, and we track the movement of the muscles in the face, and we correlate that with emotions. So we know how people feel when they're looking at the stimuli we're setting forth. But now we have the wireless version of this. So we no longer have to put the artifacts in the person's face, and we track this wirelessly. And we also have galvanic skin responses, which measure also excitement and what's happening in other different activities in the brain in terms of pulses. We measure, for example, when a person is getting excited, there's a little bit more of sweat, so that increases the water that goes through the skin, and so we can measure that with GSR. We can measure and track the pulsations of the heart, respiration rates, everything else. And we have an electroencephalogram, which essentially we look at the activity in the brain, in the scalp, when the person is responding to these stimuli. So here is an example of the last study, which, by the way, Bachir and Michelle have been tirelessly working with. They have been sleep deprived for the last 3 weeks or so, just making sure that I get this video for today. We were literally collecting data yesterday or the day before. And so this is one of the subjects looking at the stimuli in the computer. So we have a camera that looks at the respondent. And what you see on the right-hand side here is what the person is seeing. This is what the person is going to be looking at in making different purchasing decisions. This is the participant. And these are all the emotions that we're tracking live. So it's a live view for you. What you see, you probably cannot see from the back, but this is the activation of joy, anger, confusion, frustration, overall positive feelings towards what they're looking at, negative feelings, and high or low engagement of the brain as they look at these different products. So the question here that we're trying to answer, which I'm going to come back to this in a minute, is what happens in the brain when a person decides to purchase something versus not purchasing something? Can we predict that decision even before the person is conscious about what decision they're going to be making? So what they're looking at right now is just a blank slide, and there is a product. I'm going to talk about this later, but essentially these are the exact pictures that people will see if they were purchasing products from the Walmart catalog. So it's the exact same picture. So perhaps they're not purchasing the products in the stores, but with the increase of e-commerce, they're making the decision as to whether or not they will buy this product, and this product is the exact picture from the Walmart shelves, which at the end of the day, Michelle goes and buys directly from Walmart, so they get exactly that product for which the picture was taken from professionally from Walmart. So how can we use this? Well, the first thing is we can answer questions that we're interested in terms of behavior, but we can also improve the methods that we use to measure those things. So let me give you an example of an eye tracking study we conducted recently. And the question is, well, does water saving in horticulture makes an impact in plant purchases? Does it really matter? And does it matter whether the water savings are done in the production system or if the water savings were bred to be used in the landscaping of the homeowner? So what we did is we used a very kind of standard methodology of discrete choice methods or conjoint analysis that is very well used in the agricultural economics literature. And perhaps one of the criticisms of this technique is that it's hypothetical. So if I ask you all a question, hypothetically, your answer might be hypothetical. So in order for people to reveal their true decisions, some people argue, you have to make it economic incentible. What that means is that you have to make those choices matter. So if somebody told me, well, I'm willing to pay $20 for that organic product instead of the regular product that I use, well, there has to be an economic consequence. Otherwise, they can just tell you anything, and it's very difficult to assess whether that's true or not. So what we did is, number one, is we actually make these experiments non-hypothetical. So that in itself was interesting. So we make it some economic consequences. The way we did that is we selected one of the choices to be random, and then we came up with a market price. So we choose a price, and then we told people, well, if that market price is lower than what you selected, then you're going to have to buy the product at the market price, just like you would if you go to a grocery store or a garden center. And so that's the main idea here. And so to keep the experiment very simple, we had 3 different attributes. One, there was no water conservation practices at all. Another one, there was water conservation in the production side. And the other one was water conservation in the landscape. We had different prices and we had different species. What we found was actually in the design, we made sure that each one of those characteristics was independent from each other. That's what orthogonal means. And we had different alternatives. So under every single choice set, each individual could choose among 3 products, or they could choose not to buy any of the products. So similar to what they will go to the store, they like one of the products, they can buy them. If they didn't like it, they can select, I don't want to buy any of these products. Okay? And the catch is that we randomized the position of the computer screen of the products. So what did we find? This is an example of the choice set. So a person will see a picture of these. And so they will say, I want to get this plant, B, C, or D, or I choose not to buy any of them. Okay? So this is what happened, and this is a combination of several of the subjects who have participated in the eye tracking device. So they start in the center because we had a pointer. They go to the upper left, they go to the upper right, then they come down to the lower right, lower left, and lower right. So they search most of the products in a Z fashion. If you ask me what did they choose, I can tell you with 99% confidence that all of these people, including this video, chose the upper left corner because that's the last thing they saw. So very likely is, oh, I'm about to click this, I'm about to select this. That's probably what they chose. So let me show you some statistics. The statistics I'm going to show you is the time to first fixation, or how long it took a person to look at one of these products for the first time, the number of times that they look at the products, and the total time that they look at those. So you saw the plants, the pots, and the signs with the information. What you see here is that the total visit duration for the plants on average was 0.35 seconds. That's almost nothing, and that's very consistent with grocery store and in-store response time that people look at different products. So we have a very short window of opportunity to capture the attention of consumers. The range was from 0, when a person didn't actually look at some of the products at all, to 7.6. When you look at the pots, 5.2 milliseconds, nothing. This is to be expected because we put a very standard black pot that had no features at all. We didn't want the pot to take any of the attention. The range was from 0, not looking at it at all, to 1.3 seconds. And the sign was, the average was about 1 second, 1.04 second, ranging from 0 to 15.4. So this is what happened in the experiment. This is the time that people dedicated to look at each one of those choices. And recall that we had 9 different choices that people made. So what happened? They got tired. They got fatigued. The responses might not have been as good after a few choices. But this is the way that we do standard procedures to evaluate consumer valuations, right? So what do we do about this? Well, does the way in which we present the products has an influence? Well, let's look at this. What this shows is a computer screen. So the first graph that you see here is how long it took for a person to look at the product for the first time. So when the product was at the upper left corner, it only took them about 1.6 seconds. And then that time started to go up when you look at the right, upper right position. So you can see that people look at this option first. They look at it more often, 6.5 times almost compared to the other ones. And they look at it for longer periods of time. If the product was placed in that position, there was a 63% chance that would be the first product that people will see. If it wasn't the first one, there would be a 20% chance that it would be the second one. So you can start to see that the way in which people evaluate products and the position has an effect. And of course, marketeers have known this for many years, and this is why they have different products placed in different parts of the shelves in the grocery stores, because they know that this process happens. And this is how people choose based on the position of the screen. So when there was no product at all, you look at the proportion of the no product options chosen in each one of those computer screens. It's very close to 1. There's no variation. When there's no information, people choose in the computer screen almost in about the same proportion, which is what you expect to see. However, when there is information about the product, what happens is that people tend to choose more this other option, the second one. Wait a minute, didn't we just say that people look at the first upper alternative first? But they tend to choose the second one more often. So what do you guys think is happening? I think what's happening is that people are using that first alternative as an anchor, as a baseline. And they're starting to make their comparison with the others. If they find a better alternative, they choose somewhere else. If they don't, they tend to choose this one. But after they get tired, notably, they tend to choose that option a little bit more often. So the point of the story is, well, we can look at the results. Does the position has an influence? Yes, it does. We can see that statistically. We can see that econometrically. We can see that the time they look at the products will influence their final decision to buy something or not. So we can improve the methods that we use for evaluation of products by using some of the equipment, as you can see in this case. So the suggestion is actually very simple. Use the position of the screen as part of your design so that you can actually control for it, which people don't do at all. But this is some of the things that we can learn. So does it pay off to do water-saving landscaping in the landscape? Well, if it's in the landscape, you see that there is a $2 increase in willingness to pay, but not so in production. Why do you think that's the case? Perhaps it's because people are thinking about what they're going to be saving if that plant is grown in their own landscape in terms of water savings, as opposed to anything else that is not going to benefit them more economically. Perhaps it will benefit them philanthropically, but not that much in the bottom line cost in their houses, in the water bills. So there are location premiums. We can improve the designs of what we do by using some of the equipment already. And people search in this natural process of reading in a Z motion. So where do we read? From left to right, top to bottom. And that's the way in which people search for those products, whether it's in the supermarket, whether it's in a choice experiment or somewhere else. Okay, so what about brain scanning? What are we measuring with EEG? Well, we have different brain waves that we measure. The first one is the delta brain that goes from 0 to 4 frequency or hertz. It's typically associated with deep sleep. We have the theta wave, which is drowsiness or mental load. The alpha is a very important one, and it happens about 8 to 13 hertz. What that means essentially is if you look at 1 second, if you look at the alpha wave, you will see one of those waves 10 times a second because they happen in a frequency of 10 hertz. So if you look at that, there will be 10 waves in 1 second on average. So why is that important? Because we can measure that activity in the brain in 2 ways. The first one is the event-related potential. So what's happening in the brain when people are making these decisions or choices. And what we do essentially is we track the averages of different stimuli. We average those results by those stimuli, and then we average that into a grand average of participants, and we see if there is different activation under different type of conditions. One of the main ones that people have used, and there is a person, Thomas Ramsøy over in Denmark, who's actually done this in the store, looking at the approach and avoidance. And what he sees is that there is a theory that there's more activation of the left side of the brain compared to the right side of the brain when there is positive feelings or approach, and the contrary happens when there's withdrawal. So the whole idea is if we can measure that, does that have an effect in the bottom line purchases? What this guy observed was that in the grocery store, when people went and purchased the products, this phenomenon happened. So what we are trying to do in the experiment that we're running today, currently, is trying to see if we can predict what people will buy. Now, this behavior is not unique to purchasing. It has been associated with emotional changes and responses mainly for psychological reasons. It's been associated with pre-goal attainment and emotion enthusiasm. Why is that important for all of us? When people are dieting, when they're keeping an exercise regime, all of these things are activating the prefrontal cortex in order for them to maintain that enthusiasm. More activation of the left prefrontal cortex is associated with monetary reward-related cues. It's associated with higher monetary risk-taking, and it's also associated with lower punishment in ultimatum games. Ultimatum games in economics are a way of measuring fairness views in a way. So the game consists basically in having 2 people. Actually, there's a family of games called the dictator game. And you ask a person, well, I'm going to give you an allocation of money, and you decide how much of that money you're going to give to another person. So if I give you $10, how much of the $10 are you going to keep for yourself, and how much of the $10 are you going to give to the other person that you're going to be matched with, essentially. So you observe what people do, and you observe the characteristics about fairness views. In the ultimatum game, what happens is that the second person has some veto power. So what you do is you say, well, wait a minute. The same idea goes, so I'm going to give you $10 in allocation, and you're going to give some of that to the second person you're going to be matched with. If this person says, good, then everybody gets the allocation that you proposed. But if the person says no, nobody gets anything. So if I give you $10, you give me 10 cents, the other person can say, oh, no, we don't get anything. And so you play that game repeatedly to see how people perceive fairness, and then what happens when a person intentionally does something to change the balance of that redistribution, right? So there's a lot of activity that happens in the brain when these things are happening. So what we are trying to do is use this methodology in the experiment I mentioned to predict purchases. There are one special condition that we're doing here, which is essentially, number one, can we predict choices? But what happens to those choices when people have self-restraint, or others call it resource depletion? And does that affect the purchasing decision? We all know that they tell you not to go to the grocery store when you're hungry, because if you're hungry, you're going to buy more stuff, right? So this is what these theories are all about. The first one is knowledge. That essentially means that if you know that you're supposed to activate some self-restraint, the moment you activate it, it's like a switch. So once you start self-restraining, you self-restrain. Okay, that's number one theory. So if that's the case and that theory holds, what that means is that people, when they activate the switch, they should purchase less. They should self-restraint and activate, make less purchases. The other one is that it's a skill, like a muscle. And the more you self-restrain, the better you get at it. So every time you say no to the cookie, every time you say no to the chocolate cake, the better you become at saying no. So if that's the case, you wouldn't really expect any changes in the near term because all learning happens in the long run. So you're not going to become good at something by looking at an experiment. So you really expect to see no change in terms of the purchasing behavior if that theory holds. And the last theory is the strength model. What that says is that self-restraint is like a muscle, but in a different way. Once you exercise left restraint, you got out of batteries. And you use all of the self-restraint that you can, and then you are out of it, and then you exercise less. So, for example, if you say, well, I don't really want to go exercise this morning. I'm too tired. So I had a very long night last night, but I'm going to go anyway. So you go exercise, and you come back and say, wait a minute, I just ran. So I deserve to have 2 eggs instead of 1, right? Because you already exercised that restraint, and your brain started working in a sense of saying, well, I've already restrained from this. I'm going to do something else. And you restrain less in other activities. So what we did is we had 60 right-handed students, A&M students, and we showed them 4 different products. 80 different products for 4 different categories. The categories were food, office supplies, health care, or personal care, and home products. The idea here was to see if self-restraint affected these categories differently. In other words, when you have this self-restraint, are you able to say, I'm not going to purchase that detergent, but you're going to eat that cake? And does that explain in part why we have this obesity epidemic in the U.S.? The catch was we showed people different 80 products, and they could decide to get $5 or they can purchase the product. The catch being that each product was priced at $10. So they could decide to buy it or not, depending on whether what they choose to do. So what we did is we show an initial fixation point, then we show the product, and as I mentioned before, that was the exact picture from the Walmart website, so it's the actual products that were later purchased in Walmart, so the decisions were binding. After they saw the 80 experiments, we picked 4 of them, and whatever they chose in those 4 decisions, we gave them. So if they chose the product, we'll give them the product. If they chose not to buy the product, we will give them the $5. And we did 4 of them so that they didn't really know at the beginning which of the products was going to be real or binding, so they had to treat all of the 80 products real. At the end of the experiment, Michelle took a bingo game with 80 balls inside, and we took 4 balls out, and then if we got 27, decision number 27, they said, I'm going to purchase the product. They get the product. If they didn't purchase the product, they get $5. So here is the catch. Half of the people, actually a third of the people, we haven't really completed the 3rd treatment, but for a control group, people just went directly to make the choices. For the other group, which I'm going to show you, they had to do this restraining task. So we told them, you have to keep your eyes in that circle at the bottom. Please refrain from looking at anything else. If you find yourself looking at something else, please go back to that circle as soon as you can. Because we have the eye tracking device tracking at 300 data points per second. We know exactly what people are doing. We know exactly how many times each person went outside of the circle. We know what's the percentage of time that people actually spend within the circle. And that ranges from a low of 36% compliance. So whatever happened at the top, I'm going to show you a short part of that video, but whatever happened at the top must have been interesting because for that particular individual, only 36% of the time he spent in that lower portion, and to a low of about a 99% compliance. So those dots that you're going to see are the heat maps. So that shows what people are looking at when they're looking at the video. And by the way, this is something that we could do with commercials, so we can look at what's catching the attention of a person. We can look at packaging and look at the recall capacity of a person, and we can look at the purchasing decisions after they look at that video. What you're going to see here is the frustration. And you see very quickly here is this a 30-second time frame? In a 30-second time frame, frustration is going up, which means it's going down. So in the scale. So people are becoming less frustrated. They're getting used to the task. So they're exercising. The more they exercise that self-control, the less frustrated they feel about it. And then there's engagement. They go back and forward. You're going to see what happens with what they're looking at here shortly. By the way, there is some sound to the video just to make it more difficult for people from refraining in looking at the top. Oh. So you can imagine how difficult it is to try just to keep your eyes within that circle, right? That's self-restraining in a way. And people had to watch this video for over 6 minutes. I can see some people getting dizzy in the back just looking at this for 10 seconds. Well, you didn't see the sound, but there were some sirens in the middle, like woo, 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 and some of disturbing signs that actually created some awareness and a lot of people wanted to see what happened. So the first part I'm going to show you is what happened to the purchase decisions. This is what happened overall. So we got close to about 20-something%, close to 25% of the subjects in general decided to purchase some of the products, okay? If you look at the baseline compared to the treatment, you see a lot more purchases, 515 purchases compared to 443 when people had to watch that video. Now, what happened with the different food categories? Look, food, a lot less purchases of food. Now, this is contrary to what a lot of the literature suggests in terms of self-depletion makes you eat more. So thinking aloud, and this is what Michelle's dissertation topic is going to be about how self-restraint interacts with purchasing versus eating and versus other activities. So for example, it is very likely that people are not purchasing food products, perhaps because they're self-depleted and they don't want to go to the store and prepare the food. Perhaps they just go and get the food as fast as they can in a fast food restaurant. Who knows what's happening? Because the decision here is to purchase, is not to consume the products. If you look at personal care, well, we observe a difference, but it was not as significant as it was with food. Office supplies, I don't think that this is statistically different. I haven't really checked, but it looks very close. And home products, there was a big decision, a big change there. So there is a difference in the type of products in terms of the decision as to how self-restraint operates in the decision as to purchase products. So the bottom line, with all of these activities, there are many different things that we can study. Are we proposing to change and revolutionize and do everything completely new? No. We're saying we can use some of this equipment to improve our understanding of the consumer. We can use it to understand the methods that we use. We can combine these with traditional data collection methods to make them better and to improve our understanding of the consumer. Why? Because in many cases, consumers are not rational. They're heavily influenced in the environment, in the context, in the emotional state that they're in, and they use those emotions to make the decisions. And so indeed, it is a very exciting time to be alive, and it's a very exciting time to be an economist. Thank you very much.